Cold seeped through the floorboards of the rented carriage, gnawing steadily at Genevieve's ankles. It was a wet, biting cold, the kind that smelled of damp horsehair and stale river fog. She kept her hands folded over her lap, the stiff, unyielding taffeta of her travelling gown digging a sharp line into her ribs. Every jolt of the iron-rimmed wheels over the rutted Yorkshire roads sent a jarring ache up her spine, but she did not adjust her posture. Posture was all she had left. 72 hours. That was how long it had taken to travel from the crumbling remnants of her father's London townhouse to the iron gates of Alderley Hall. 72 hours of breathing in coal dust, eating hardened biscuits that tasted of ash, and staring at the rain-streaked glass, wondering what a man she had met exactly twice would look like in the harsh light of morning. Roland Hastings, the Duke of Alderley. Her father had sold her to him for the sum of £40,000. Of course, polite society called it a dowry in reverse, a settlement of estates, a mutually beneficial union between old blood and new money. But Genevieve was a pragmatist. She knew a transaction when she saw one. Roland needed a mother for the wild, feral children his late wife had left behind, and Genevieve's father needed to keep the bailiffs from dragging him to Fleet Prison. It was a clean, bloodless exchange. The carriage groaned as it took a sharp turn, the wheels crunching over thick gravel. Genevieve leaned forward slightly, peering through the rain-blurred window. Alderley Hall was not a fairy tale castle. It was a fortress of dark, weather-beaten stone that crouched against the moors like a sleeping beast. There were no welcoming lanterns blazing in the windows, no sweeping gardens of manicured roses, just a sheer face of slate and granite, heavily shadowed by ancient, twisting oaks that looked as though they were trying to strangle the masonry. Good, she thought with a dry, cynical edge to her internal voice. I don't think I could have stomached roses. The carriage lurched to a final violent halt. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. The rain drummed a relentless, heavy beat against the roof. Genevieve waited for the grand doors to open, for the footman to rush out with umbrellas, for her soon-to-be husband to emerge with a polite, stiff smile to help her down. She waited. The cold gnawed higher up her calves. Finally, the carriage door was yanked open by her own hired driver, his face dripping with rainwater and irritation. He offered a gloved hand, muttering something unintelligible about the mud. Genevieve grasped his hand and stepped down the heels of her leather boots, sinking immediately into the sodden gravel. She stood in the rain, the heavy velvet of her cloak instantly soaking up the moisture, growing heavy against her shoulders. She looked up at the massive oak double doors still closed. "Is there a bell?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly from disuse. She sounded utterly ordinary, not like a duchess, just a tired 24-year-old woman with a headache. Before the driver could answer, the heavy iron latch clacked loudly, and one of the massive doors groaned open inward. A sliver of pale yellow light spilled onto the wet stone steps. A woman stood in the doorway. She was tall, with a back as straight as a ruler and greying hair pulled so tightly into a bun it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a permanent scowl. She wore the stark black bombazine of a head housekeeper. She did not bow. She merely stared at Genevieve, her eyes flickering down to the mud accumulating on the hem of the new Duchess's gown. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "We were not expecting you until tomorrow." Genevieve felt a muscle twitch in her jaw. The humiliation was sudden and sharp, a bitter taste flooding the back of her throat. Not expecting her. She swallowed it down. The roads were clearer than anticipated. "I am Genevieve, Mrs. Gable, housekeeper." The woman finally stepped aside, gesturing into the cavernous of the entrance hall. "You had best come in out of the wet." Genevieve stepped over the threshold. The air inside Alderley Hall was freezing. It smelled of beeswax, cold ash, and something older like wet wool and neglect. The entrance hall was absurdly large, dominated by a sweeping double staircase of dark mahogany, and walls lined with the disapproving portraits of long-dead Hastings ancestors. I will have the footman fetch your trunks, Mrs. Gable said, already turning her back. I assume you will want tea. I would like to see the Duke. Genevieve said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast empty space. Mrs. Gable stopped. She turned slowly, her hands folded primly at her waist. A tight, humorless expression settled over her features. His Grace is not here, madam. Genevieve blinked. The sheer absurdity of the statement took a moment to penetrate her exhaustion. Not here. We are to be married on Thursday. His Grace sent word 3 days ago. Business in Parliament detained him. He is still in London. He expects to arrive by Friday. Friday? Genevieve repeated the word, feeling hollow in her mouth. Yes, madam. The vicar has been informed of the delay. Mrs. Gable looked at her, a silent, damning judgment in her pale eyes. She was looking at a bride who had travelled across the country only to be left standing in a draughty hallway completely abandoned. Shall I have a fire lit in your chambers? Genevieve felt a sudden dangerous prickle behind her eyes. It wasn't sorrow. It was sheer unadulterated fury. He hadn't even bothered to send a rider to intercept her carriage. He had let her arrive at his ancestral home cold and exhausted to be greeted by a hostile housekeeper. But as quickly as the anger flared, a strange heavy relief settled over her. She didn't have to pretend tonight. She didn't have to sit across from a stranger and make strained, polite conversation. She didn't have to smile. Yes, Mrs. Gable. A fire would be excellent, Genevieve said, her voice dropping back to a flat, pragmatic monotone. And tea. A very large pot. Do not bother with fine china. I am far too tired to appreciate. Mrs. Gable's eyebrows ticked upward a fraction of an inch, surprised by the lack of hysterics. Very well. I will have the parlour prepared. As the housekeeper walked away, her heavy shoes echoing sharply on the marble floor, Genevieve stood alone in the centre of the hall. She unclasped her wet cloak, the heavy fabric slipping from her shoulders and pooling on the floor with a wet thud. She didn't pick it up. She just stood there listening to the silence of the house, realizing with a cold certainty that she had traded one empty, dying home for another. The parlour was slightly warmer than the hallway, though that wasn't saying much. A meagre fire crackled in the massive hearth, struggling to combat the dampness that seemed baked into the walls. Genevieve sat in a high-backed leather wing-back chair, her boots propped unapologetically toward the grate. She had removed her hat, allowing the heavy dark pins to clatter onto the small mahogany side table. Her scalp ached where the hair had been pulled back for 3 days. She ran fingers through her dark hair, letting it fall in messy, unkempt waves over her shoulders. Propriety be damned. The master of the house wasn't here, and the staff clearly didn't care. She closed her eyes, the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner serving as a hypnotic metronome. She was drifting into a shallow, uneasy sleep when a sound pulled her back. It wasn't a loud noise, just the faint scuff of a shoe against the Persian rug, the subtle creak of a floorboard. Genevieve didn't open her eyes immediately. She listened. The breathing was too fast, too shallow to be an adult's. Someone was watching her. She opened her eyes. Standing 10 feet away, perfectly still, were 2 children. They did not look like the cherubic, pink-cheeked offspring depicted in the miniature portraits Roland had sent her father. They looked like creatures dragged from the woods. The boy had to be Leo, was perhaps 11. He was tall for his age, painfully thin, with a sharp, angular jaw and dark, hostile eyes that mirrored the portraits in the hall. He wore a linen shirt that was missing a button, and his trousers were stained at the knees. He stood with his feet planted wide, his chin jutting out in a defensive posture, holding what looked like a heavy iron fireplace poker loosely in his right hand. Half hidden behind him was the girl, Clara, 6 years old. Her blonde hair was a tangled rat's nest, and she wore a faded blue dress that was at least a size too small, the cuffs frayed. In her arms, she clutched a dead-stiff-looking crow, its black feathers dull and matted. Genevieve did not gasp. She did not smile. She simply stared back at them, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy and uncomfortable. She noticed the smell, then a distinct odor of wet earth, copper, and unwashed hair. "You're in my father's chair," the boy said. His voice was a surprisingly deep, gravelly thing, entirely devoid of the high-pitched innocence of childhood. Genevieve did not move. She let her gaze drop to the heavy iron poker in his hand, then back up to his face. It's not very comfortable. He should consider having it restuffed. Leo's jaw tightened. He had clearly expected her to jump up to apologize, to try and coddle them. Her absolute lack of reaction threw him off balance. He gripped the poker tighter, his knuckles whitening. "You're the new one," he stated, less of a question and more of an accusation. "I am Genevieve," she replied, keeping her voice level, devoid of any maternal sweetness. She had never been good with children, and she wasn't about to start faking it now. "And you must be Leo and Clara." She shifted her gaze to the little girl. Clara stared back with wide, unblinking eyes, holding the dead bird tighter against her chest. "What happened to the crow?" Genevieve asked. Clara didn't answer. She just shrank further behind her brother's leg. She found it. Leo snapped, stepping defensively to block his sister from view. "It hit the glass in the conservatory. It's hers now. It's going to start smelling very soon," Genevieve pointed out reasonably. "And it will carry fleas. I highly suggest burying it before it ruins her dress entirely." Leo sneered, a remarkably ugly expression on a child's face. "You can't tell us what to do. You aren't our mother. Thank God for that." Genevieve muttered under her breath, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The headaches returning with a vengeance. She looked back at the boy. "No, I am not your mother. I am your father's future wife. That makes me your stepmother, a title I assure you I am just as thrilled about as you are." Leo blinked, the sneer faltering for a fraction of a second. That was not the script he had prepared for. The last governess had cried when he spoke to her like that. "Father isn't here," Leo said, his voice taking on a cruel, mocking edge. "He left. He probably realized he didn't want you after all." It was a childish barb meant to wound, but it struck closer to Genevieve's own insecurities than she cared to admit. A sudden sharp pain flared in her chest, but she buried it instantly under a layer of cold pragmatism. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, bringing herself closer to his eye level without actually standing up. "Perhaps he did," Genevieve said evenly. "Or perhaps he is delayed by matters far more important than greeting a woman he bought to balance his ledgers. Either way, he is not here, which leaves just the three of us." She slowly pushed herself out of the chair. She was tall, taller than the boy by a good head and shoulders, and she saw the momentary flash of uncertainty in his eyes as she stood to her full height. She didn't approach him. She just smoothed the wrinkled taffeta of her skirt. "I have been sitting in a carriage for 3 days, Genevieve said, her tone suddenly brisk and authoritative. "I am cold, I am hungry, and I am entirely out of patience. You will put the poker back by the fire before you hurt yourself, Leo, and Clara, you will leave the bird outside. If you bring it to the dinner, I will have Mrs. Gable roasted." Clara's eyes went perfectly round. She looked down at the dead bird, then back up at Genevieve, her mouth hanging slightly open. Leo's face flushed a deep, angry red. "You can't, I can," Genevieve interrupted smoothly. "And I will. Now go wash your hands, both of you. The dirt under your fingernails is frankly appalling." She turned her back on them, an immense gamble, and walked toward the small tea tray Mrs. Gable had finally left on the sideboard. She poured herself a cup of lukewarm, oversteeped tea. She listened intently, her heart thumping a dull rhythmic ache against her ribs. "Call my bluff," she thought. "Throw the poker at me. Let's see how broken this house really is." For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then there was the sharp clatter of iron hitting the stone hearth. Genevieve took a sip of the bitter tea, hiding the microscopic exhale of relief. A moment later, she heard the scuff of shoes retreating toward the door. As she turned back around, the parlor was empty. The fire crackled weakly, and the poker was leaning haphazardly against the brickwork. She was alone again. But the silence in the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer empty. It was a battleground. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. The dining room of Alderley Hall was built for a sprawling dynasty. The mahogany table was long enough to seat 30 people comfortably. Tonight, it was set for 3. Genevieve sat at the head of the table, the seat of the Duchess. It felt absurd sitting in the high-backed, heavily carved chair, staring down an expanse of polished wood that gleamed like dark water under the sparse candlelight. The chandelier above them remained unlit, the room relying on a few silver candelabras that cast long, distorted shadows against the flocked velvet wallpaper. Leo sat at the far opposite end, occupying his father's chair with a rigid, defiant stiffness. Clara sat exactly in the middle on the left side, swinging her legs so that her boots rhythmically kicked the table leg. Thwack. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the scrape of silverware against cheap porcelain and Clara's relentless kicking. The food was atrocious. It was a clear indication of how the staff functioned without a master present. The mutton was grey and tough, sitting in a pool of congealed greasy gravy. The potatoes were cold, and the carrots had been boiled to a mushy, flavourless pulp. Genevieve chewed a piece of meat, mechanically fighting the urge to spit it out into her linen napkin. She took a sip of her wine. It was thin, sharp, and tasted faintly of vinegar. She placed the crystal goblet back down with a sharp clink. "Is this what you usually eat?" Genevieve asked, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded abnormally loud in the cavernous room. Leo looked up from his plate. His eyes narrowed. He hadn't touched his food, merely rearranging the grey meat with his fork. "The chef left last month," he said defensively. "Mrs. Gable cooks now. She says plain food builds character." "Mrs. Gable is a liar who doesn't know how to render fat," Genevieve replied plainly. Clara stopped kicking the table. She looked at Genevieve, a flicker of genuine surprise cutting through her feral exterior. She slowly lowered her fork, watching the new woman with the cautious intensity of a stray cat. Leo bristled automatically, rushing to defend the established order of his miserable life, even if he hated it. "You shouldn't speak about the staff that way. Father says," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "What does your father say?" Genevieve prompted, leaning forward slightly, her chin resting on her steepled fingers. Leo's dark eyes locked onto hers across the vast distance of the table. "He says women who marry for titles are leeches. They only want the money and the name, and they don't care about anything else." It was a direct hit, a brutal, unfiltered piece of truth delivered by an 11-year-old boy trying to draw blood. Genevieve felt a hot flush creep up her neck. The cynical, defensive part of her wanted to snap back to remind him that she was the only reason his father wasn't facing a scandal, that she had been traded like a prized mare. Instead, a strange, choked sound escaped her throat. It took a moment for Leo to realize she was laughing. It wasn't a pretty musical laugh. It was a harsh, dry sound born of exhaustion and the sheer absurd reality of her life. She laughed, reaching for her terrible wine and taking a long, unladylike swallow. "Your father," Genevieve said, wiping a stray drop of wine from the corner of her mouth, "is entirely correct. I am here because my family is entirely bankrupt. I am here because your father's title and wealth shielded me from ruin. I am a leech, Leo." The boy stared at her, utterly paralyzed. He had expected her to cry, to deny it, to storm out of the room. The absolute, brutal honesty of her admission left him with no ammunition. But Genevieve continued, her tone hardening, dropping the remnants of her smile. "That does not mean I am required to eat grey meat and drink sour wine in a freezing house. And it certainly doesn't mean I am going to let you two live like feral animals in the woods." She stood up. The heavy chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. She picked up her plate of untouched mutton and walked over to the bell pull hanging near the fireplace. She yanked it hard. A minute later, a young, terrified-looking footman appeared in the doorway. "Take this away," Genevieve commanded, shoving the plate into his hands. "Take all of it away. Tell Mrs. Gable that if she attempts to serve me boiled shoe leather again, I will personally see her dismissed the moment the Duke returns. Understood?" The footman swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Leo, then back to the tall, imposing woman in the dark taffeta dress. "I, your grace." "But what will you eat?" "Bread," Genevieve snapped. "Fresh bread, butter, and whatever hard cheese you have in the pantry that hasn't gone to mold, and fetch a bottle of wine from the cellar, a dusty one. Break the lock if you have to." The footman practically fled the room. Genevieve turned back to the table. Leo was staring at her, his posture slightly less rigid. Clara was watching her with open fascination, her thumb resting thoughtlessly against her lower lip. Genevieve didn't return to the head of the table. Instead, she pulled out a chair directly across from Clara, sitting right in the middle of the long, empty expanse. She was tired of shouting across the polished wood. "I am not going to pretend to love you," Genevieve said quietly, addressing both of them, but looking at Clara's dirt-stained hands. "And I don't expect you to love me. I am a stranger who moved into your house. But we are going to be living together, and I refuse to be miserable." She reached across the table, her pale, long fingers gently tapping the wood near Clara's plate. "And the next time you find a dead animal, Clara, you show it to me first. We will bury it properly. Keeping things that are dead only makes the living sick." Clara didn't say anything, but slowly, deliberately, she pulled her thumb out of her mouth. When the footman returned with a heavy wooden board laden with thick slices of crusty bread, sharp yellow cheese, and a bottle of deep red Burgundy, Genevieve poured herself a glass. The wine was rich, heavy, and tasted of dark fruit and oak. It was the first good thing she had experienced in 3 days. She cut a thick slice of bread, slathered it in pale salted butter, and handed it across the table to Clara. Then she cut another and slid it down the table toward Leo. They ate in silence. But as Genevieve took a bite of the sharp cheese, she noticed the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. It didn't sound like a countdown anymore. It just sounded like time moving forward, indifferent to the empty chair at the head of the table. Morning light in Yorkshire did not arrive. It merely seeped through the heavy velvet drapes like a pale watery stain. Genevieve woke shivering. The fire in her grate had died to a powdery grey ash hours ago, leaving the cavernous bedroom freezing. She lay perfectly still under the heavy mothball-scented down quilt, staring up at the plaster ceiling. Water damage had mapped a large yellowish stain above the canopy that looked vaguely like a bruised lung. She did not ring for a maid. Judging by the state of the dinner service last night, whoever answered the bell would likely be incompetent, resentful, or both. Instead, she pushed the covers back and swung her bare feet onto the icy hardwood floor, biting the inside of her cheek to stifle a gasp. Her traveling trunks sat by the door unlatched, but unpacked. She dragged a plain grey wool morning dress from the top layer. It was severe, high-collared, and entirely unfashionable, but it was thick. She dressed herself with clumsy, stiff fingers, abandoning the complicated corset for a simple linen chemise. She twisted her dark hair into a tight utilitarian knot at the nape of her neck, securing it with 3 heavy iron pins. When she stepped out into the corridor, the silence of the house was oppressive. It was a dying house, settling into its own rot. Genevieve found Mrs. Gable in the downstairs morning room, aggressively polishing a silver tea urn that was already dull with age. The housekeeper did not stop rubbing the metal when Genevieve entered. "I require the household ledgers," Genevieve said, her voice flat, carrying no preamble, "and the keys, all of them." Mrs. Gable's rag paused. She looked up, her grey eyes narrowing into tight slits. "The keys, Your Grace, are kept by me, by the Duke's order. The running of the house is currently a failure," Genevieve interrupted. She stepped further into the room, the scent of sharp metallic polish stinging her nostrils. "The food is inedible, the fires are improperly banked, and the children look as though they sleep in the stables. I am not asking for your permission, Mrs. Gable. I am demanding the property that belongs to my position, the keys." Now, for a long, terrifying moment, the older woman simply stared. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She had no real authority here, not until the papers were signed and the vows spoken. If Gable refused, Genevieve would be exposed as a fraud, a powerless guest. But Genevieve kept her chin level. She did not blink. She let her gaze bore into the housekeeper with a cold, dead-eyed indifference she had learned from watching her father negotiate bad debts. Mrs. Gable's jaw shifted. Slowly, with a resentment that radiated from her stiff shoulders like heat, she unclipped the heavy iron ring from her waist and dropped it onto the mahogany table. It landed with a loud, final clatter. "The books are in the library," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with venom. "On the desk." "Excellent," Genevieve replied, picking up the heavy ring. The iron was warm from the housekeeper's body, which sent a brief, unpleasant shudder through her hands. "Have a hot bath drawn for Clara before noon and scrub her fingernails. If I see dirt on her hands at lunch, I will hold you personally responsible." Genevieve turned and walked out before the woman could formulate a reply. Her palms were sweating. The library was at the far end of the west wing. It smelled of rotting paper, old leather, and stale pipe tobacco. Dust motes danced thickly in the weak shafts of light piercing the tall mullioned windows. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of grey grime. She sat at the massive oak desk and pulled the leather-bound ledgers toward her. She opened the first one. It took her less than an hour to understand the magnitude of the disaster. Roland Hastings wasn't just strapped for cash, he was hemorrhaging it. The estate was heavily mortgaged. Tenant farms were failing. Bills for grain farriers and coal were months in arrears. But interspersed with the neglect were bizarre, erratic expenditures. £1,000 for a thoroughbred mare, £400 for a London tailor. £2,000 transferred to an account she couldn't identify. He was his bleeding man buying new silk bandages instead of a tourniquet. "You're sitting in his chair again." Genevieve didn't jump. She simply closed the ledger, the heavy thump raising a small cloud of dust. She looked up. Leo stood in the doorway. He was wearing the same trousers as yesterday, though he had managed to find a coat that was slightly too large in the shoulders. He looked pale, dark circles bruising the delicate skin under his eyes. "I am," Genevieve said. She leaned back, the leather creaking in protest. "Have you come to threaten me with a poker again?" Leo scowled, shoving his hands deep into his pockets. "No. Mrs. Gable is angry." She slammed the kitchen door so hard the glass cracked. "Good. Perhaps she will spend the day sweeping instead of boiling meat to death." Genevieve watched the boy. He lingered in the doorway, caught between his desperate need to be antagonistic and his obvious curiosity. "Why aren't you with your tutor?" "Don't have one," Leo muttered, kicking the doorframe with the toe of his scuffed boot. "Mr. Harrison left in the spring. Said he wasn't being paid to freeze." Genevieve felt a dull ache throb at her temples. Of course he didn't have a tutor. "Why educate your here when you could buy a horse?" "Can you read?" she asked bluntly. Leo's head snapped up, his pride stung. "I'm 11. Of course I can read. I can read Latin too." "Some of it. Prove it." Genevieve stood, walked over to one of the lower shelves, and pulled out a heavy green-bound volume at random. She tossed it onto the desk. "Read the first page. If you stumble on more than 3 words, you will spend the afternoon sitting in the parlor copying the dictionary." Leo looked at the book, then at her, his eyes suspicious. He slowly approached the desk, peering down at the text. It was a treatise on agricultural crop rotation. He cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly before settling into that gravelly, unnatural pitch. He read. He was slow, and he butchered the pronunciation of phosphorus, but he read it adequate. Genevieve lied. It was terrible for a boy of 11. "We will start with history tomorrow morning. 9 and here. Bring your sister. Clara doesn't speak much." Leo said defensively, stepping back from the desk as if the book might bite him. "She won't read. Then she can listen." Genevieve said, turning back to the ledgers. "Go tell the footman I require a pot of strong coffee." And Leo. The boy paused at the door. "Wash your neck." He flushed darkly and disappeared down the hall. Genevieve exhaled a long, shaky breath, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The dust in the room was settling on her skin, making her feel dirty. She opened the second ledger and prepared to wade back into the wreckage of her new life. Friday slipped into Saturday with the unceremonious, rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. Genevieve was in the library. It was past 100 in the morning. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, distorted shadows across the bookshelves. She had spent the last 2 days cataloging the ruin of Orderly Hall, armed with a sharpened pencil and a growing, bitter knot in her stomach. She was wearing a woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her feet tucked beneath her on the leather armchair. She was half asleep, the numbers swimming on the page before her. A sound dragged her awake. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was the loud, violent slam of the heavy front doors, followed by the frantic barking of the hounds in the distant kennels. Heavy boots hit the marble of the entrance hall, the footsteps uneven and loud. Genevieve sat up the ledger, sliding from her lap and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She didn't move to the door. She sat perfectly still, listening. Muffled voices drifted down the corridor, the panicked high-pitched squawk of the footman, and a deep, rough voice barking a command. The heavy oak door of the library swung open. He didn't notice her immediately. The room was dark save for the dying embers. He walked straight to the side table where the crystal decanters of liquor were kept, his movements jerky and exhausted. Genevieve watched her future husband, Roland Hastings, the Duke of Alderley. He was taller than she had remembered from their 2 brief meetings in London, broader across the back. The dark wool of his great coat was soaked with rain, clinging heavily to his frame. His boots were caked in thick grey mud that flaked off onto the Persian rug with every step. He smelled of wet wool, old horse sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of cold rain. He poured a glass of amber liquid, spilling a fair amount onto the polished wood. He downed it in a single brutal swallow, his head thrown back. He coughed a harsh, wet sound and braced his hands against the edge of the table, his head hanging between his shoulders. "If you intend to drink yourself to death, you might want to review the ledgers first," Genevieve said. Her voice cut through the dark, quiet room like a blade. "I would prefer not to inherit your debts without a proper accounting." Roland whipped around his hand instinctively, dropping toward his hip as if reaching for a pistol that wasn't there. He squinted into the gloom, chest heaving. When he finally spotted her curled in the armchair, his shoulders dropped slightly, though the tension didn't leave his frame. He looked terrible. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with rain and sweat. He had a harsh, angular face, the kind of face that belonged on a medieval coin, with deep, exhausted lines carved around his mouth and dark, bloodshot eyes. "Genevieve," he said. His voice was hoarse, raspy from the road. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded tired. "Your Grace," she replied, not moving. He took a slow step toward the center of the room, unbuttoning his heavy, sodden coat. "I see you made it. 3 days ago," she corrected evenly, "to an empty house, an openly hostile staff, and 2 feral children who attempted to defend your armchair with fireplace iron." Roland winced slightly, dropping the heavy wet coat onto a nearby chair. It slithered to the floor, leaving a damp patch on the upholstery. He ran a hand over his face, rubbing his eyes aggressively. "The roads were washed out past York," he said, moving closer to the dying fire to warm his hands. He didn't look at her. "The carriage broke an axle. I had to ride the rest of the way. I sent a rider ahead. The rider did not arrive. Evidently, silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. It wasn't the nervous silence of 2 lovers finally reunited. It was the tense, calculating silence of 2 strangers trapped in a sinking ship, trying to figure out who was going to bail water first. "You look," Roland started, turning his head to finally look at her properly. He took in her plain grey dress, the messy bun, the dark smudges of ink on her fingers. "You look completely different than you did in London. In London, my father paid a maid to lace me into silk so you would sign a contract," Genevieve stated, folding her shawl tighter. "Here the fire in my bedroom is inadequate and your housekeeper hates me. This is the reality of the purchase, my lord." Roland let out a short, humorous bark of laughter. He leaned back against the mantelpiece, crossing his arms over his damp waistcoat. Purchase. Is that how you see it? It is exactly what it is. She shot back, dropping her feet to the floor and sitting up straight. £40,000 to clear your immediate creditors in exchange for a title that shields my family from debtor's prison. Let us not insult each other by pretending this is a romance. I read your books today. His posture stiffened, the amusement vanishing from his face instantly. You had no right to touch my ledgers. Someone had to. Genevieve countered, her voice rising in the quiet room. You are buying thoroughbreds while your son's knees poke through his trousers. Your daughter carries dead birds around because she has nothing else to play with. You are ruining this estate, Roland. He stared at her, genuine shock registering in his bloodshot eyes. No one spoke to him this way. Not his solicitor, not his peers, and certainly not the meek, desperate women his mother had paraded in front of him before he found Genevieve's bankrupt father. For a second she thought he might yell. His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking violently near his ear. He stepped forward, towering over her, chair smelling strongly of rain and alcohol. You are not my wife yet, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low gravel. Genevieve met his gaze without flinching. She tilted her chin up. No, I am not, which means I can still pack my trunks and leave you to drown in your own arrogance. They stared at each other, the air crackling with ugly, raw hostility. It was a bluff. She had nowhere to go, and he knew she couldn't leave without destroying her family. But he also needed her money by Monday morning, or the banks would foreclose on the London townhouse. The fight drained out of him abruptly. He took a step back, dragging a hand through his damp hair. He looked suddenly older, entirely defeated. Don't unpack your trunks just yet, Roland muttered, turning his back on her and walking heavily toward the door. The vicar's expecting us at the chapel at 10 tomorrow morning. Try to look presentable. He left the room without another word, leaving the door wide open. Genevieve sat in the freezing library, listening to the heavy, uneven thud of his boots on the stairs. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. The estate chapel smelled of mildew, wet stone, and the sickly sweet scent of dying lilies. Saturday morning was grey and unrelenting. The sky a bruised purple that promised more rain. Genevieve stood near the altar, the cold from the stone floor seeping through the thin soles of her kid leather slippers. She wore a gown of heavy, dark blue velvet. It was supposed to be her wedding dress, chosen weeks ago in a bright London modist shop. Now, in the gloom of the unheated chapel, it felt like mourning clothes. The velvet weighed down on her shoulders, dragging at her posture. Her corset was laced tight enough to restrict her breathing, a stark contrast to the freedom she had allowed herself over the past few days. She felt trapped in her own skin. Roland stood beside her. He had managed to clean himself up. He wore a severe black coat, perfectly tailored, his dark hair combed back ruthlessly from his forehead, but the dark circles under his eyes remained, and he held himself with a rigid, unnatural stiffness, staring straight ahead at the crumbling altar. They did not touch, not even their sleeves brushed. There was a deliberate, canyon-like gap of 6 in between them. Behind them, seated in the first pew, were the children. Genevieve had marched into the nursery at dawn, handed Leo a freshly pressed jacket, and personally dragged a comb through Clara's matted blonde hair, despite the child's violent kicking. Now they sat in solemn, miserable silence, watched over by a sour-faced Mrs. Gable. The vicar, an ancient man whose robes smelled faintly of mothballs and sour milk, droned on in a flat, echoing voice. He spoke of love, honor, and obedience. The words bounced off the damp stone walls, sounding hollow and entirely absurd. Genevieve stared at the flickering candle on the altar. She felt entirely numb. The panic of the past few days, the anger from last night, it had all evaporated, leaving behind a cold, clinical acceptance. This was it. This was the transaction finalizing. Do you, Roland, take this woman? Roland's jaw worked. He didn't look at her. I do. His voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. Do you, Genevieve, take this man? She took a slow, shallow breath, the rigid boning of her corset. She thought of her father's crumbling townhouse. She thought of the ledgers in the library. She thought of Clara's dirty fingernails. "I do," Genevieve said. Her voice did not shake. "The rings," the vicar prompted. Roland turned to face her for the first time. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a heavy gold band. It was old, scratched, and distinctly tarnished. He did not ask for her hand. He simply held the ring out, waiting. Genevieve lifted her left hand. Her fingers were freezing. Roland took her hand. His skin was rough, colored across the palm, his knuckles dry and cracked from the weather. His hand was surprisingly warm against hers. He shoved the heavy gold ring onto her finger. It caught for a moment on her knuckle before sliding down. It was slightly too loose, a heavy foreign weight settling at the base of her finger. She did not have a ring for him. It had not been part of the arrangement. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the vicar wheezed. There was a terrible stretching silence. In a normal wedding, this was the moment of the kiss, the romantic seal. Roland looked down at her. His dark eyes flickered to her mouth, then up to her eyes. There was a flash of something there, hesitation perhaps, or merely awkwardness. He leaned in, his movements stiff. Genevieve turned her head a fraction of an inch. Roland's lips brushed against the cold, unyielding skin of her cheekbone. His breath was warm, smelling faintly of mint and the alcohol from the night before. His bristly jaw scraped against her skin, sending a jolt of discomfort through her. He pulled back immediately, clearing his throat. It was over. So, they turned away from the altar, facing the empty chapel. Leah was glaring a hole into the stone floor. Clara was picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. Mrs. Gable looked as though she had just swallowed a lemon. "We should return to the house," Roland said abruptly, his voice loud in the quiet space. "The solicitor is waiting with the final transfer papers." Genevieve looked down at the heavy gold ring on her hand. It looked ugly against her pale skin. She was Genevieve Hastings now, the Duchess of Alderley. She had traded her future for a crumbling house, a mountain of debt, and a man who couldn't bear to look her in the eye. "Yes," Genevieve said, stepping forward, taking the lead down the aisle. "Let us go sign the receipts." Ink stained the side of Genevieve's middle finger, a permanent blue-black smear from 2 hours of signing her name, Genevieve Hastings. It looked like a forgery on the heavy parchment. Mr. Finch, the London solicitor, had packed his leather satchel with the speed of a man desperate to escape a plague ship. He took the signed contracts, the transfer deeds, and the bank drafts that effectively drained her father's remaining capital to appease Roland's immediate creditors. Now, the library door clicked shut behind him, leaving Genevieve and her new husband alone in the dust-choked room. Roland exhaled a long, ragged breath. He walked straight past his desk, heading for the crystal decanters on the side table. It was barely noon. "Stop." Genevieve's voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp, cutting edge that halted him mid-stride. He turned, his hand hovering inches from the glass stopper of the brandy decanter. He looked at her, his brows drawing together in genuine confusion, as if a piece of the furniture had just spoken. "We have just spent £40,000, Genevieve said. She stood by the desk, resting her ink-stained fingers lightly on the leather surface. "I will not have you celebrating our mutual poverty by drinking yourself into a stupor before lunch." Roland's jaw tightened. The exhaustion that had plagued him during the ceremony was rapidly morphing into defensiveness. "I am having a single glass of brandy in my own home, Genevieve. I suggest you go to your chambers and rest. You've had a trying morning. I am not a fragile debutante who needs to lie down after holding a pen," she retorted, pulling the heavy brass ring of keys from her velvet skirt pocket and dropping it onto the desk with a loud metallic clatter. "And this is our home now, which brings me to the household accounts." He finally lowered his hand from the decanter, turning to face her fully. The broadness of his shoulders suddenly seemed less like a physical trait and more like a barrier. The household accounts are managed by me and Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable couldn't manage a tea party in a dollhouse. Genevieve fired back, stepping around the desk. The velvet of her gown hissed against the floorboards. She steals the good tea, she doesn't order enough coal to heat the upper floors, and she serves your children meat that I wouldn't feed to the hounds. And you bought £1,000 horse while the roof in the east wing is rotting. A dark flush crept up Roland's neck. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, stopping just a foot away. He smelled of rain-sharp wool and the bitter scent of old resentment. You read my private ledgers, he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous vibrating low. You overstep, madam. I took inventory of my purchase. She replied, refusing to back up, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her tight corset. She tilted her chin up, forcing him to look down into her eyes. You sold me a title, Roland, but you failed to mention the estate was bleeding to death. I will not sit in a freezing parlor and wait for the bailiffs to arrive just to protect your bruised pride. He stared at her, his chest heaving with constrained fury. He was accustomed to women who shrank from his temper, to servants who bowed to a world that deferred to his rank, even as it whispered about his debts. Genevieve did not shrink. She stared back with cold, pragmatic defiance. What do you want? He demanded, the words tearing out of him. The lockbox, she said instantly. The combination to the safe in the study. I want total control over the household expenditures. You will not buy so much as a new riding crop without my signature. In exchange, I will figure out how to stretch the remaining funds to fix the roof, hire a decent cook, and keep your children from freezing this winter. Roland laughed, a harsh, scraping sound. You want to put me on an allowance in my own dukedom. I want to keep you out of debtor's prison. Genevieve shouted, the sudden volume surprising even her. The library echoed with the sound. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. You are drowning, Roland, and you are holding your children underwater with you. Let me bail the water. Give me the lockbox. For a long, terrible minute, the only sound in the room was the rain lashing against the mullioned windows. Roland looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face for a crack, a sign of weakness or perhaps a hidden motive. He found only the exhaustion and stubbornness that mirrored his own. Slowly, the tension bled out of his shoulders. He looked away, staring at the scarred wood of the desk. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. He didn't hand it to her. He dropped it onto the desk next to the heavy ring she had taken from Mrs. Gable. Don't sell the horses, he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of fight. They are the only things left on this estate worth anything. He turned and walked out of the library, leaving his brandy untouched. Genevieve let out a shaky breath, her knees suddenly trembling. She picked up the small brass key, the metal cold and biting against her palm. It was a victory, but it felt entirely like a defeat. Coughing echoed down the dark corridor, a wet rattling sound that tore through the quiet of the house. Genevieve woke instantly. It was Tuesday, 3 days after the wedding. She sat up in the darkness, the freezing air of her bedroom instantly biting through her thin linen chemise. She listened. The cough came again, followed by a high, thin whimper. It was coming from the nursery. She didn't bother ringing for a maid, nor did she search for her slippers. She threw her heavy woolen shawl over her shoulders and practically ran down the hall, her bare feet slapping against the icy floorboards. She burst into the nursery. The room was suffocatingly hot and smelled strongly of sour sweat, old wool, and vomit. A meager fire burned in the grate. Leo was standing beside the narrow bed, his eyes wide and terrified in the dim light, clutching a soiled washcloth. In the bed, Clara was threshing. The little girl's face was flushed, a terrifying mottled purple, her blonde hair plastered to her skull with sweat. Her chest heaved with every rattling breath. What happened? Genevieve demanded, crossing the room in 2 strides. She was sick, Leo choked out, his voice cracking. He looked small, suddenly entirely stripped of his usual defensive sneer. She threw up. Now she's burning. I couldn't find Mrs. Gable. Good. Mrs. Gable is an idiot, Genevieve said briskly. She placed the back of her hand against Clara's forehead and yanked it back immediately. The child's skin was radiating heat like a furnace. Leo, go to my bedroom. Bring the pitcher of water from my washstand, the clean basin, and all the towels you carry. Run. Leo didn't hesitate. He bolted from the room. Genevieve stripped the heavy smothering down quilt off Clara. The girl whimpered, curling into a tight shivering ball. Genevieve ignored the sound, pulling off the soiled nightgown with quick, unsentimental efficiency. It wasn't a time for gentleness. It was a time for speed. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hall, much heavier than Leo's. Roland appeared in the doorway wearing nothing but his trousers and a loose linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His hair was wild. I heard coughing, he said, stepping into the room. He stopped dead when he saw Clara thrashing on the mattress. All the color drained from his face. My God. What is it? A fever, Genevieve said, not looking up as she felt for the pulse at Clara's neck. It was racing a frantic flutter under the skin. Probably from wandering around the damp gardens for months. Open the window, Roland. The air in here is putrid. Open it. She's shivering. She's burning from the inside out. She needs air. Genevieve snapped, looking up at him with wild, fierce eyes. Do it. Roland flinched, but he moved, unlatching the heavy window and throwing it open. A blast of freezing, wet night air rushed into the stifling room. Leo returned, panting, his arms full of towels and the heavy porcelain pitcher. Genevieve snatched a towel, dunked it into the freezing water, and wrung it out, carelessly splashing water onto the floorboards. Hold her down, Genevieve ordered Roland. He hesitated, his hands hovering awkwardly over his daughter. I don't want to hurt her. You will hurt her if she thrashes and cracks her head against the headboard. Hold her shoulders. Roland pressed his large hands onto Clara's small shoulders, pinning her flat against the mattress. The child let out a raw, agonizing wail. Genevieve gritted her teeth and pressed the freezing wet cloth to Clara's chest and neck. The girl screamed, arching her back against Roland's grip. Shh, I know, Genevieve muttered, though her voice lacked any maternal sweetness. It was a rhythmic, commanding chant. She dunked another cloth and pressed it to Clara's forehead. Keep holding her, Roland. For 3 hours, it was a brutal, grueling war. Genevieve continually rotated the cloths, dipping them in water that rapidly grew lukewarm, barking orders at Leo to fetch fresh water from the kitchen pump. Roland stayed by the bed, his hands firmly but gently holding his daughter, his eyes fixed on Genevieve with a strange, intense desperation. Genevieve's arms ached. Her back throbbed from leaning over the low bed. The smell of sickness was to the fibers of her own clothes, settling into her skin. She felt entirely out of her depth, terrified that the small, fragile life under her hands was going to slip away while she played at being a nurse. She wasn't a mother. She was a ledger keeper, but she didn't stop. She poured water down Clara's throat whenever the coughing subsided, ignoring the water that spilled down the child's chin and soaked the sheets. She wiped the sweat, checked the pulse, and commanded the men in the room with the ruthless authority of a general. Sometime around 400 in the morning, the violent thrashing stopped. Genevieve froze, her hand hovering over the water basin. She looked down. Clara lay still, her breathing shallow but no longer rattling. The terrifying purple flush had faded from her cheeks, replaced by a sickly pale white. Genevieve pressed the back of her hand to Clara's forehead. The furnace heat was gone. Her skin was damp and cool. The fever broke. Genevieve whispered, her voice cracking. Roland let out a sound that was half sob, half exhale. He slumped forward, burying his face in the damp mattress next to his daughter's head. Leo, exhausted and shivering in the corner, slid down the wall and put his head on his knees. Genevieve stood up slowly. Her legs felt like lead. She mechanically wrung out the final towel and draped it over the edge of the basin. The room was a disaster. Water pooled on the floor, soiled linens piled in the corner, the fire dead. She looked at Roland, whose large shoulders were shaking slightly as he kept his face buried in the bed sheets. Genevieve felt a strange, tight pulling in her chest. She reached out, her fingers hovering for a second before she rested her hand lightly, awkwardly, on the back of his neck. He went still at the contact, but he didn't pull away. Grey light bled through the open window, painting the ruined nursery in the cold, unforgiving tones of dawn. Genevieve sat in the rocking chair in the corner. She hadn't left the room. She was slumped backward, her heavy woolen shawl pulled tight around her chin. Her bare feet were numb, tucked beneath her on the seat. She was staring blankly at the wall, her mind too exhausted to formulate a single coherent thought. Leo was asleep on the floor, curled up like a dog on a pile of dry blankets Roland had fetched an hour ago. Clara was sleeping deeply, her breathing quiet and even wrapped in a fresh, clean quilt. A shadow moved across her vision. Roland was kneeling by the small grate, quietly adding lumps of coal to the newly revived fire. He used the iron tongs with a careful, deliberate precision, trying not to make a sound. His white linen shirt was stained with soot and water, his hair falling into his eyes. He finished with the fire and stood wiping his dirty hands on his trousers. He looked over at the bed, then at Leo, and finally his gaze settled on Genevieve. He didn't say anything. He walked out of the room, his footsteps light. Genevieve closed her eyes, preparing to drift into a shallow, uncomfortable sleep. But less than 10 minutes later, the floorboards creaked. She opened her eyes to see Roland standing in front of her. He held 2 chipped porcelain mugs. Steam rose from them in thick, twisting ribbons. He held one out to her. Genevieve reached out her hands, shaking slightly from exhaustion, and took it. The ceramic was blisteringly hot, sending a painful, glorious wave of warmth through her frozen fingers. She brought it to her face, inhaling. It was tea, real tea. Roland didn't retreat. He sat heavily on the wooden floorboards, just a few feet from her rocking chair, crossing his long legs, entirely unbothered by the dust. He took a sip from his own mug, staring into the flickering flames of the grate. Mrs. Gable hides the good Darjeeling behind the flour sacks, Roland said quietly, his gravelly voice keeping to a low murmur. I found it. You made Sade, said, her voice raspy. The concept felt entirely surreal. A duke sitting on a dirty floor brewing stolen tea. I boiled water, he corrected dryly. I may have steeped it too long. It tastes a bit like wood. Genevieve took a sip. It was bitter, scalding, and perfect. The hot liquid slid down her throat, easing the tightness in her chest. It's the best thing I've had since I arrived. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the coal, the steady breathing of the children, and the faint clink of porcelain as they drank. The animosity that had defined their interactions for the past week felt distant, burned away by the terror of the night. I didn't know what to do, Roland said suddenly. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the fire. His voice was stripped of all its usual arrogance, leaving behind something raw and deeply uncomfortable. When I saw her like that, I completely froze. If you hadn't been here, he trailed off, his throat working. Genevieve rested her mug on her knee, letting the heat seep through the heavy wool of her dress. I didn't know what I was doing either, she admitted, the truth slipping out easily in the grey dawn. I was terrified I was going to drown her or freeze her to death. Roland turned his head to look at her. The exhaustion on his face mirrored hers, but the hostility in his dark eyes was gone. He looked at her, not as a transaction, not as an intruder, but as the woman who had fought a fever for his daughter with her bare hands. You didn't, he said softly. He looked down at his mug, swirling the dark liquid. The accounts are a mess, he said, shifting the topic abruptly, though the vulnerability remained in his tone. I know they are. I inherited the debts from my father, and I tried to gamble my way out of them. Horses, investments that went nowhere. I ignored the rot because looking at it felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs. Genevieve watched him. She could have snapped at him. She could have reminded him of his failures. But sitting here in the quiet aftermath of a crisis, the anger felt useless. The roof in the east wing needs timber before the winter snow hits, she said. keeping her voice entirely pragmatic, entirely grounded. And we need to dismiss Mrs. Gable. I found a discrepancy in the grocer's bills. She's been skimming. Roland let out a short, tired laugh. He leaned his head back against the wall. Dismiss her today. I'll write the severance. Genevieve took another sip of her tea. It was cooling fast. We are going to have to sell the London townhouse. All of it. The furniture, the silver, everything. We can't afford to maintain a property we never use while this one crumbles. He didn't fight her. He didn't bring up his pride or his status. He just nodded slowly, staring at the ceiling. Sell it. But the bay mare stays. A tiny, reluctant smile pulled at the corner of Genevieve's mouth. One horse. But you are mucking out her stall. We are letting the stable boy go. Roland turned his head, catching the ghost of her smile. The corner of his own mouth ticked upward, a fleeting, tired expression that transformed his harsh face into something strikingly human. Deal, he whispered. He reached across the space between them. He didn't grab her hand. He simply tapped his knuckles lightly against the side of her porcelain mug. The quiet clink rang softly in the nursery. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. They were still strangers bound by a contract, trapped in a decaying house with a mountain of debt. But as Genevieve looked at the suit on his hands and felt the warmth of the tea in her stomach, the crushing weight of the house felt a fraction lighter. They were no longer fighting each other in the dark. They had picked up the buckets, and for the first time, they were bailing the water together.